A highly respected but arrogant doctor refuses to let a black nurse assist in his surgeries, believing he is not skilled enough. However, when the doctor's young son is brought into the ER after a tragic accident, the only medical professional available to perform the life-saving procedure is the very nurse he humiliated. Faced with the reality that his son's life depends on the man he underestimated, the doctor experiences a shocking change of heart. The hospital was a blur of movement. Doctors in white coats rushed between operating rooms, nurses checked vitals, and the sound of heart monitors filled the air. It was another chaotic day, where every second could mean the difference between life and death. In the midst of it all, Dr. Richard Wallace, a renowned but notoriously arrogant surgeon, stood at the operating table, barking orders. His sharp eyes flicked to Marcus Evans, a highly skilled black nurse who had just stepped forward, ready to assist in the procedure. Dr. Wallace's expression hardened. "Step back," he snapped. "I don't need your help." Marcus hesitated, confused. He had assisted in countless surgeries before. Why was this one any different? "I said, step back." Dr. Wallace's voice was sharper this time, his tone leaving no room for argument. The other nurses exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the unnecessary hostility. Marcus swallowed his pride and stepped away, his face composed but his heart heavy. This wasn't about skill or experience. This was about bias. What Dr. Wallace didn't realize? The very man he just dismissed would soon be the one he'd be begging for help. Have you ever been underestimated? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more eye-opening stories. The prestigious city hospital was a place of excellence, a facility where only the best and brightest worked, where life-or-death decisions were made in an instant. The gleaming hallways were lined with awards, and the operating rooms were equipped with cutting-edge technology. But beneath the surface of professionalism and prestige, tension simmered. Among the staff was Marcus Evans, a highly skilled black nurse who had earned the respect of his colleagues through sheer talent, hard work, and an unwavering dedication to his patients. He was known for his steady hands, sharp instincts, and ability to remain calm under pressure. Yet, despite all of this, he was constantly forced to prove himself. His experience and skill meant little in the eyes of some, especially Dr. Richard Wallace. Dr. Wallace was one of the hospital's most celebrated surgeons, brilliant, highly sought after, and feared. He had an elite education, a spotless record, and the kind of arrogance that came from believing he was the smartest person in any room. To him, titles and degrees defined a person's worth, and, in his mind, nurses were merely assistants, especially ones like Marcus. It wasn't the first time Dr. Wallace had dismissed Marcus. It was a pattern. Every time Marcus was assigned to his operating room, he was pushed aside, his capabilities questioned, his presence barely acknowledged. Yet Marcus never argued. He stayed professional, knowing that his skill would eventually speak louder than the prejudice against him. Meanwhile, Dr. Wallace had a son, 10-year-old Liam, a boy full of life and curiosity with none of his father's arrogance. Liam adored his dad, believing him to be the greatest doctor in the world. He had no idea that his father's view of the world was flawed, that the man he admired so much looked down on people like Marcus, not because of their talent, but because of their background. On this particular day, Dr. Wallace had once again dismissed Marcus from assisting in surgery. As Marcus stepped back, one of the other nurses leaned in and whispered to a colleague, "One day, he'll regret it." They had no idea how soon that day would come. The calm routine of the hospital was suddenly shattered by a blaring alarm. The loudspeaker crackled to life, delivering a message that sent chills down the spine of every medical professional nearby. Code Blue. Trauma Unit. A child. Severe internal injuries. Doctors and nurses sprang into action as the ER doors swung open with force. A gurney sped down the hallway, pushed by frantic paramedics, its wheels screeching against the polished hospital. Floor. On it lay a small, limp body. Unconscious, his skin pale, his clothes stained with blood. Marcus Evans had seen many emergencies in his career, but when his eyes landed on the boy's face, his breath caught in his throat. Liam Wallace. His mind reeled. Dr. Wallace's son. The cruel irony of the moment hit him like a punch to the gut. The same man who had humiliated him, dismissed his skills, and treated him as if he were lesser. His own son's life was now in Marcus's hands. A quick glance around the trauma unit confirmed what he already suspected. Dr. Wallace was still in the middle of a critical surgery, completely unreachable. He wouldn't know. Not yet. Marcus looked at the nurses and doctors around him. Some of them hesitated, casting uneasy glances his way. They all knew how Dr. Wallace treated him. They had witnessed the dismissive comments, the subtle insults, the outright refusal to work, alongside him. For a brief moment, Marcus felt the weight of injustice pressing down on him. Would Dr. Wallace have ever imagined that the same nurse he constantly belittled would one day hold the fate of his only child in his hands? But Marcus pushed the thought aside. There was no time for resentment, no time for ego. A child's life was on the line, and no matter whose son he was, Marcus had sworn an oath to save lives. "Get me an ultrasound now," Marcus ordered, his voice steady and commanding. His hands were already working, assessing Liam's condition with the precision and expertise that had taken years to perfect. Nurses snapped out of their momentary hesitation and jumped into action. Marcus pressed his stethoscope against Liam's chest. His heartbeat was weak, faint, barely there. Time was slipping away. "BP dropping, 70/40, one of the nurses shouted. Marcus's jaw clenched. "He's losing too much blood. We need to act fast." The ultrasound confirmed his fears. Internal bleeding. If they didn't operate immediately, Liam wouldn't make it. "Page the OR," Marcus said firmly. "We need to prep for emergency." Surgery. Now. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. If he failed, Dr. Wallace would never forgive him. But more than that, he would never forgive himself. He looked down at the fragile body beneath his hands. No hesitation. No second-guessing. Only one thought mattered. He was going to save this child. Dr. Wallace burst into the ER, his pulse racing, his mind clouded with fear. His surgical gown was still stained from the operation he had just completed, but none of that mattered now. All he could hear were the frantic voices of the nurses, the beeping of machines, and the pounding of his own heart. His eyes scanned the room desperately until they landed on the operating table. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing over Liam's small, fragile body, was Marcus Evans. The very man he had dismissed, humiliated, and refused to work with was now leading the emergency procedure that stood between his son and death. Wallace froze in place, unable to move. The sight was almost too much to process. Marcus, his hands steady, his face composed, was performing a complex, highly delicate procedure. Wallace knew this technique. It was one that required extreme precision, a technique that not every doctor could execute flawlessly. Yet here was Marcus, moving with the expertise of a seasoned surgeon, his team hanging on to his every command. A surge of helplessness washed over Wallace. He was used to being in control, used to making decisions that others followed without question. But now he was the one waiting, watching, hoping. He had no power in this moment. His son's life rested in the hands of the man he had never given the respect he deserved. Wallace tried to speak, but his voice cracked. What's happening?" Without taking his eyes off his work, Marcus responded, his voice level and controlled. "Your son has severe internal bleeding. The liver was ruptured on impact. I'm performing a specialized procedure to stop the hemorrhaging before it's too late." Wallace's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't a standard procedure. It was an advanced technique, one that only the most skilled professionals could execute. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a shaky step forward. "I can assist." "No." Marcus's voice was calm but firm. "I need the room clear. I need full focus." Wallace staggered back, stunned. He wasn't being asked to assist. He was being asked to step aside. The weight of the moment crashed down on him. This was his son, his only child, and he couldn't do anything but watch. Marcus was the only one who could save him now. A deep shame settled in Wallace's chest. The same man he had disregarded time and time again. The same man he had refused to let assist him in surgery was now the only person standing between his son and death. His throat felt dry, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, please, save my son." It was a plea, a desperate, humbling plea. For the first time in his life, Dr. Richard Wallace was begging. Marcus didn't stop working. He didn't even glance at Wallace. His hands remained steady, his focus unshaken. But when he finally spoke, his words hit like a hammer to Wallace's chest. "I was going to save him either way, Doctor." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. There was no anger, no resentment, just truth. Wallace felt his knees tremble. The power dynamic had completely shifted. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. For the first time, he realized that Marcus wasn't just a nurse. He wasn't just an assistant. He was the man who was about to save his son's life. The beeping of the heart monitor was the sweetest sound in the world. Liam's small chest rose and fell steadily, the color returning to his pale face. The worst was over. Marcus had saved his life. Dr. Wallace stood frozen, staring at his son, overwhelmed with emotions he couldn't name: relief, gratitude, and deep, crushing shame. Just minutes ago, he had been the man in charge, the doctor who dismissed others without a second thought. But now he was just a father who had nearly lost everything, and the only reason he hadn't was because of Marcus. The hospital staff stood in quiet awe, the irony hanging heavy in the air. Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew. Dr. Wallace, the renowned surgeon, the man who refused to let Marcus assist in his operating room, now owed him everything. Marcus finished the final touches, checking Liam's vitals one last time. His hands, still stained with blood, were steady, the hands of a man who had just saved a life. Dr. Wallace opened his mouth, but no words came out. He felt raw, exposed. For the first time in his career, he was truly humbled. He had spent years believing that status, education, and reputation determined a person's worth in medicine. But today, Marcus had shattered that belief. His lips trembled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong." Marcus finally turned to look at him. His expression wasn't smug or bitter, just calm, composed. He studied Wallace for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I know." His voice held no resentment, no need for an apology. "But what matters now is that Liam is alive." Wallace swallowed the lump in his throat. His arrogance had almost cost him his son. And yet Marcus had done what Wallace himself could not. He had acted with selflessness, without hesitation, without judgment. As Liam stirred slightly, his fingers curling against the sheets, Wallace's vision blurred. Marcus had saved his son's life, and in doing so, he had changed Wallace's forever. The next morning, the hospital staff gathered in the conference room, expecting the usual morning briefing. Nurses and doctors filled the space, whispering among themselves, their curiosity piqued by an unusual announcement from Dr. Wallace himself. He was never one to call unnecessary meetings, so why today? Dr. Wallace stood at the front of the room, but he didn't wear the same air of superiority that usually surrounded him. His usually confident posture was replaced with something quieter, more subdued. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. For the first time in his career, he felt nervous. "I called this meeting," he began, his voice steady but lacking its usual arrogance, "because I need to acknowledge a mistake. A serious mistake." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. "Dr. Wallace? Admitting a mistake?" His eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on Marcus, who stood toward the back, arms crossed, face unreadable. "I have spent years believing that being a doctor meant being the most important person in the room," Wallace continued. "That only those with the highest degrees, the most prestigious backgrounds, had the right to lead in medicine." He exhaled, his voice tight with emotion. "But last night, that belief almost cost me my son." A hushed stillness fell over the room. Everyone had heard about what had happened in the ER. Everyone knew who had saved Liam Wallace's life. Wallace turned fully toward Marcus now. "I have dismissed you, belittled you, and refused to see your skill because of my own ignorance." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward. "But when it mattered most, when my son's life was on the line, it was you who saved him." Marcus stood still, unreadable as dozens of eyes turned toward him. Wallace took a deep breath, swallowing the last bit of his pride. "I owe you more than just gratitude. I owe you an apology." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nurses nodded approvingly, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Never in all their years had they seen a doctor, let alone Wallace, admit he was wrong. "I want to make things right," Wallace continued. "Effective immediately, I'm submitting a recommendation for Marcus to receive a senior leadership position in this hospital. His skills, his dedication, and his integrity deserve recognition, far beyond what I have given him." The room erupted into applause. Nurses, doctors, and even administrative staff clapped, not just for the promotion, but for what it represented. Marcus, however, remained still. Slowly, he stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Wallace. For a moment, there was silence. The entire hospital staff watched, waiting. Then Marcus extended his hand. Wallace didn't hesitate. He clasped Marcus's hand firmly, shaking it with the respect it had long deserved. In that moment, they were not doctor and nurse. They were equals. As the applause continued around them, Wallace realized something he never thought possible. He felt lighter. It had taken losing control, losing his power, losing the certainty he had always clung to for him to see what truly mattered. Marcus had saved 2 lives that night. One was Liam, the other was Dr. Wallace himself. And as Wallace finally let go of the last remnants of his pride, one thought settled in his heart. Sometimes, life humbles you in ways you never expect. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And today, Marcus Evans proved that true skill knows no race. Dr. Wallace walked away from that moment not just as a surgeon, but as a changed man. He had built his career believing that power came from status. But Marcus had shown him that real power came from skill, compassion, and integrity. The hospital had changed too. The staff who had once silently accepted the hierarchy now questioned their own biases. Other doctors, once blind to their own privilege, began recognizing the value of every member of the team, regardless of title or background. But for Marcus, the recognition was never the goal. He had always known his worth. He had never needed Dr. Wallace's validation. What mattered was that, in the end, the right lesson had been learned. Have you ever had to prove yourself to someone who underestimated you? How did it change you? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And if you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life lessons. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges the way we see the world. See you in the next one.